I'm Aaron Maté, sitting in for Jimmy Dore, here with Americans comedian Kurt Metzger and the miserable liberal Steph Zamorano. And here is some recent news from CENTCOM, that's the U.S. Central Command. ISIS senior leader killed and 4 U.S. service members wounded in helicopter raid in northeastern Syria. Because, oh yeah, guess what? We have a U.S. occupation force occupying 1/3 of Syria. We never talk about it, but it's happening. And here, 4 U.S. service members just got wounded in a raid. And the reason we don't talk about it is because our media pretty much never reports it, except for on this occasion. This is back in 2018. Look at the headline from the Washington Post. America's hidden war in Syria. U.S. troops will now stay in Syria indefinitely, controlling 1/3 of the country and facing peril on many fronts. That's 2018.
Oh, well, I'll give you guys that. What? Trump. That's the answer to the war in Syria.
So like this headline says, there is a hidden war in Syria, and it's hidden because our media pretty much refuses to cover it. And now the U.S. is occupying 1/3 of Syria. And that region, as you can hear about on shows like the Jimmy Dore Show and read about at the Gray Zone, that region of Syria happens to have Syria's most valuable wheat and oil resources. And that's why the U.S. is there.
You know, we're not keeping it and selling it. It's just to hurt them.
Exactly.
It's not, there's not enough oil. Like, they don't really sell their oil, I guess, right?
They sell it to fund their proxies like the Kurds. But yes, it's, the main goal is to hurt the rest of Syria, to keep it poor and divided, because Syria, as we'll talk about, was the site of a dirty war where the U.S. armed sectarian death squads, and the U.S. didn't win. They succeeded in leaving a lot of Syria in ruins, but they didn't overthrow the government.
You're welcome, Syria.
You're welcome, Syria. Now you get, as your reward, you get a U.S. military occupation stealing what it can from you.
And you should probably pay us a little bit for that. That's not cheap.
So here is now a new announcement from Congressman Matt Gaetz. He's a Republican, and he says this: what are we trying to win in Syria? If Biden has a plan worthy of risking American lives, he should tell it to Congress. I haven't heard one. And he's saying that because he's introduced a measure to withdraw all U.S. forces from Syria. And once it gets introduced, there has to be a vote in the coming days. So this is his new initiative to get a U.S. withdrawal from Syria. And this is what Matt Gaetz says. He says the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the sole power to declare war. To date, Congress has never authorized kinetic participation of U.S. armed forces in Syria. Additionally, pursuant to Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution, Congressmember Gaetz' War Powers Resolution mandates the removal of U.S. armed forces from Syria no later than 15 days after the date of the resolution's adoption. So he wants a vote now to get U.S. troops out of Syria now. He goes on, Congress has never authorized the use of military force in Syria. The U.S. is currently not in a war with or against Syria. So why are we conducting dangerous military operations there? President Biden must remove all U.S. armed forces from Syria. America first means actually putting the people of our country first, not the interests of the military-industrial complex, said Gaetz. And he also added this. He said, mounting concerns continue to signal that President Biden himself does not have a cognitive grasp on the Syrian conflict. During an August 2021 interview with ABC News on U.S. involvement in the Syrian conflict, Biden stated, "We don't have military in Syria to make sure that we're going to be protected." At the time of the interview, the U.S. had an estimated 900 troops in Syria.
You know, Matt Gaetz is not in his prime.
Well, this is what Matt Gaetz is referring to. This is Biden back in August 2021.
How about the threat to the United States? Most intelligence analysis has predicted that al-Qaeda would come back 18 to 24 months after a withdrawal of American troops. Is that analysis now being revised? Could it be sooner?
It could be, but George, look, here's the deal. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they metastasize. There's a significantly greater threat to the United States from Syria. There's a significant greater threat from East Africa. There's significant greater.
Is that because we work with them in Syria? They're pals now, man. Good guys. You see Rambo 3? Gave a kid a knife.
We're going to hear Biden admit that later on, that the U.S. and its allies do work with al-Qaeda in Syria.
A threat to other places in the world than it is from the mountains of Afghanistan. And we have maintained the ability to have an over-the-horizon capability to take them out. We don't have a military in Syria to make sure that we're going to be protected.
And you're confident?
So he already said that we don't have a military in Syria to make sure that we're protected. Now, you can interpret that many ways. The way Matt Gaetz interpreted it is that that Biden doesn't seem to be aware that the U.S. has a military occupation inside Syria.
But is that just Biden lying?
who knows what's going on in Biden?
He really is the perfect president.
Going to have that in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I'm confident we're going to have the overriding capability, yes. The deal is the threat from al-Qaeda and their associate organizations is greater in other parts of the world to the United States than it is from Afghanistan.
All right, so keep that clip in mind because we're going to hear Biden explain shortly why there is a threat from al-Qaeda in Syria, which he acknowledged accidentally a few years ago. Here's more from Josh Landis. He is a scholar at the University of Oklahoma, a specialist in Syria, and he's talking about Matt Gaetz's announcement of a resolution to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. Landis quotes Gaetz, "If Joe Biden wants to keep U.S. troops in the Syrian conflict, he should have to explain to us what the goal is and what winning looks like. One of my greatest disappointments in the 118th Congress is that people who I thought were anti-war Democrats seem to be consumed have been cheerleaders for our armed conflict," Gaetz said. That's Josh Landis quoting Matt Gaetz. And so why is the U.S. in Syria? Well, there's no better authority than U.S. officials themselves. So here is, first of all, Dana Stroul. She is now a senior Pentagon official responsible for the Middle East, including Syria. And back in 2019, when she was the head of a congressional study group, she explained why U.S. troops are in Syria.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic.
Hear that? We own 1/3 of Syrian territory via the U.S. military. That's her acknowledging that. We own it because we're occupying it.
Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria study groups.
Only about 1,000 troops. It's a light footprint for us. So, hey.
This is just a smug. She sounds like she went to the Victoria Newland School of Statecraft and Baking.
And ask yourselves, I mean, did anybody vote for this person to occupy 1/3? Did anybody in Syria vote for her to occupy their country and steal their oil?
She made Newland cookies.
Port, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here. And
so hear that?
The hydrocarbons.
The hydrocarbons. The 1/3 of Syria, it's the resource-rich portion of Syria that we own because we're occupying it. And she's almost salivating over it because these warmongers, they get meaning in life from occupying foreign countries and stealing their resources. And look how proud she is of this U.S. policy of owning another country's rich region where they have their oil and their wheat. You know what this sounds like? You know, like with a stereotype lady at the office who runs like the Secret Santa, except it's some murders on it broad. So it's just worldwide conflict. Like, she wants to say oil, but I guess she knows she can't say hydrocarbons.
That's what that is, right?
Yeah,
they know it's not cool to keep saying oil.
Oil, yeah. You got to say it's hydrocarbons.
Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse.
Agricultural powerhouse. That means wheat. That means the ability for Syria to feed itself is being owned by the U.S. and stolen from them.
We argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned.
Again, we own it. We own it because we're there with our military.
Both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict.
So there we go. Owning that part of Syria gives us control of the resources, and that gives us leverage, like any good mafia don wants, to bully Syria into doing what it wants. In this case, overthrowing Bashar al-Assad. So that's Dana Stroul.
It's not to bully Assad, it's to bully the people that live there.
Yes.
Into having revolution because we want it.
Exactly right.
Well, what's wrong with that?
So that's Dana Stroul in 2019. And you hear her laying out the actual reasons for the U.S. occupation of Syria, okay? Fast forward to 2021, when she announced the Biden administration is committed to keeping U.S. troops in Syria. And check out her new explanation for why U.S. troops are there. And you're not going to hear her be as honest as she was back in 2019. Now there's a new rationale for why the U.S. is in Syria.
Senator, first of all, one of the key recommendations of the Syria study group was that we should retain our U.S. military presence in northeast Syria, both because ISIS is not defeated, because we made commitments to the Syrian Democratic Forces.
You piece of shit. Well, she looks a lot better, though. Can I give her credit? She looks like she's been taking care of herself a little more.
So ISIS is not defeated, and we have to be there for our Kurdish partners, which means our proxies, the people we're using to weaken Syria. So now the rationale has changed. We have to be there to defeat ISIS.
Wow. You know, evil looks good on her. Victoria Nuland blows her right up being evil. This one, she's getting better.
That they continue to fight ISIS, but cannot do that without our support, training, and advice. And because there are tens of thousands of ISIS
They need our support and training, our advice. The Kurds do. That's why we have to be there.
detainees still under SDF custody, as well as families of ISIS fighters at the Al-Hol IDP camp. We provide, through security cooperation authorities and funding, support and training so that there's a humane and humanitarian approach to the families and children while we facilitate relocation to the countries of origin of those foreign fighters and facilitate long-term solutions to the Syrian and Iraqi detainees. So first of all, for retaining U.S. military presence, the Biden administration is committed to retaining U.S. military presence in northeast Syria.
So you hear that? The rationale is now completely changed. In 2019, when she's the head of a congressional study group, she's openly acknowledging that we're there to steal their oil and their resources because that gives us leverage because we own 1/3 of Syria, and that means we can help dictate who gets to rule Syria. Now in 2021, she's back serving under Biden, and now it's, we have to help our partners and take care of the prisoners that are there and fight ISIS.
Wait,
Okay?
she said help the ISIS families?
Yeah, because there are detainees. There are, because the U.S. Helped ISIS spread inside Syria. And we're going to get to that. But basically, ISIS came into Syria from Iraq because of the Iraq war. And then initially, when ISIS was spreading in Syria, the U.S. was sitting back and watching and letting ISIS grow because they thought ISIS would put enough pressure on Assad, and that would force Assad to negotiate with the U.S. and allow someone who the U.S. likes to take his place. And we're going to get to that. But now, because ISIS has spread, there's all these prisoners from ISIS that are being held, and she's claiming that we're there to hold on to them. That's why we need to be there. Totally forgetting that she had said before we need to be there to steal their oil.
Oh, I thought it was like we have to take care of their families, because they're
them
hooking
too.
us up.
Well, the families too of these fighters are in these horrible camps.
Like the mom, I take care of my family when I go in.
That is what she's saying. But look, another person who admitted the actual reason why the U.S. was in Syria is not just Dana Stroul back in 2019. It's also this guy, Donald Trump, back when he kept U.S. troops in Syria. This is what he said.
We've secured the oil, and therefore a small number of U.S. troops will remain in the area where they have the oil. And we're going to be protecting it, and we'll be deciding what we're going to do with it in the future.
What now? Here's the difference between an idiot like Trump and a great woman like Stroul or whatever her name is. He didn't say hydrocarbon. That's why he's not fit to be president. He doesn't know how to say hydrocarbon.
We're there
It's
to
not
take.
hard.
We're there to take the hydrocarbons. Doesn't have the ring to it. We're there to take the oil.
Steal the terrific hydrocarbons. And meanwhile, we're not doing that, right? Like we're not selling their hydrocarbons. It's just to hurt them. We're not profiting from that.
But this is a good example of how U.S. officials are more honest than U.S. media stenographers. Because the New York Times, check out this recent article in the New York Times. This is how every time they talk about why the U.S. is in Syria, this is what they'll say. They won't quote actual U.S. officials like Dana Stroul and Donald Trump saying we're there for leverage and to steal their oil. They'll go with the official propaganda line, the one that they're told to say, which is this, that about 900 American troops remain in Syria chasing the remnants of the Islamic State. So they just happen to be there. We just happen to remain there, and we're just chasing around the Islamic State. We're just chasing them around.
Oh.
What's left. So that's what New York Times says, because they're not allowed to actually acknowledge the openly admitted reasons for being in Syria as articulated by people like Donald Trump and Dana Stroul.
Why are they not allowed to? By who? The finance people? Like is it like Northrop Grumman or whoever pays for it, or is because why is the government able to?
Well, because Donald Trump blurts out the truth sometimes because he's a loudmouth, and that's why they don't like him. And Dana Stroul, when she made that admission we saw in 2019, she wasn't speaking to us, the public. She was speaking to a congressional hearing.
We can always take that down off the internet.
Yeah, well, and also it's not intended for the public. It's not like they don't think people like us are going to be watching these long hearings. That's for their own internal purposes as they're planning on how to pillage Syria. So they can speak the truth there. But when the public is told about why we're in Syria, this is what we have to be told. We're just there chasing the Islamic State. But I wrote an article back in September 2021 pointing out what a lie it was. Even if you put aside the question of do we have the right to be in Syria to begin with? Of course we don't. It's an illegal occupation. Syria doesn't want us there. Putting all that aside, even the official pretext that we're there to fight ISIS, it's a lie. And the reason we know that is because the Pentagon, which is in Syria, produces reports pretty often showing what they're doing in Syria. They have to explain by law basically what they're doing in Syria. So they have to produce these reports every couple of months articulating what they're doing in Syria. And they point out this, and I wrote about this in this article called "To Keep U.S. Troops in Syria, U.S. Leaders Are Lying Like in Afghanistan." And this is what I wrote. The U.S. government's claim to be occupying Syria to fight ISIS is undercut by a series of admissions concealed from a wide audience. In overlooked statements and briefings, U.S. officials have disclosed that U.S. forces are barely doing any fighting against ISIS in Syria, and for good reason. As is also quietly acknowledged, fighting ISIS is not the reason why they're there. In reality, after a decade-long, multi-billion-dollar CIA dirty war that failed to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad, the U.S. is using its soldiers, along with crippling sanctions, to keep Syria divided, impoverished, and unable to rebuild.
You're welcome.
And this is my source. This is a report from the Pentagon Inspector General on what's called Operation Inherent Resolve, and that's the code name for the U.S. occupation of Syria and also the U.S. military presence in Iraq, which, by the way, is also done over the objections of the Iraqi parliament, who has called for the U.S. to leave, but we just ignored that and threatened to withhold their money if they push through with it. So we're still in Syria, we're still in Iraq. But there are these reports that have to be produced to document why we're there and what we're doing there. So this is what one of these reports pointed out. So this is a chart of the coalition airstrikes, that's the U.S. coalition, targeting ISIS in Syria from April 2020 to June 2021. And look what happens. So here you have, in 1 month, in December 2020, you have 15 airstrikes. Look what happens after that, though. January, February, March, April, May, June. It goes down to up to just 3 airstrikes a month. And in June, there's none. So in this whole period, there's almost no fighting going on by the U.S. against ISIS at all, just 2 strikes. And of course, they say that they're against ISIS, but sometimes the U.S. will bomb Syrian government forces or Syrian government allies. So who even knows if these minimal airstrikes here are even against ISIS?
My bet is that they were to help ISIS and not fighting ISIS. That'd be my bet.
And that is a safe bet given the history, which we're going to get to in a second. So, and I go on, this tracks with what U.S. officials have quietly acknowledged to reporters. In reality, Politico reports, citing a Pentagon source, no American troops have accompanied local forces on combat patrols for over a year in either Iraq or Syria. So the U.S. isn't engaging in combat with ISIS forces because they're not there to fight ISIS. They're there, as Donald Trump and Daniel Stroul admitted, to take the oil. And another reason why the U.S. doesn't really care about ISIS is because John Kerry admitted back when he was Secretary of State in a private recording, he didn't know he was being taped, he admitted that the U.S. watched ISIS grow in Syria in the hopes that ISIS's growth in Syria would threaten Bashar al-Assad. And just as Dana Stroul said that the U.S. is using its military occupation of Syria as leverage against Syria, John Kerry explained how, according to U.S. strategy, ISIS was leverage too.
The reason Russia came in is because ISIL was getting stronger. Daesh was threatening the possibility of going to Damascus.
Daesh is ISIS, ISIL. So Daesh, ISIS, is threatening the possibility of going to Damascus. And check out what John Kerry says about how the U.S. responded to that.
So forth. And that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want a Daesh government.
So Russia came into Syria not to conquer Syria because they didn't want an ISIS government, according to John Kerry.
We can't allow that.
Well, Kerry can allow that because watch this.
And they supported Assad. And we know that this was growing. We were watching. We saw that Daesh was growing in strength.
We were watching. We saw that ISIS was growing in strength. So what did you do? Did you intervene to stop ISIS from growing in strength, John Kerry?
And we thought Assad was threatened. We thought, however, we could probably manage, that Assad might then negotiate.
Oh, so you were watching ISIS threaten to take over Damascus, have an ISIS government, and you decided instead of doing something about it, helping to stop ISIS from growing, you thought we could manage, and that might even force Assad to negotiate his way out of power. So in short, Kerry is saying here that the U.S. was using ISIS's growth as leverage to oust Assad.
Why? What is our beef with Assad at all? Like
he's not under our control.
Is that it?
Yep, and he supports people who resist Israel. He's allies with Hezbollah and Iran, and they resist Israel. So therefore, Assad has to go.
Okay, but ISIS can stay.
ISIS can grow because we can manage that.
Well, they're good guys, man.
Instead of negotiating, you got Assad. Now you got Putin, support it.
All right. So that's how the U.S. really feels about ISIS. They're leverage when the U.S. needs them to help overthrow a government that's not under our control.
Well, now that we know Putin doesn't like them, I think it's time to unite with them.
And so remember before how Joe Biden said that the big threat to the U.S. from al-Qaeda is in Syria, not in Afghanistan anymore? He's right. What he left out, though, was the key role of the U.S. and its allies in creating that al-Qaeda safe haven inside of Syria and letting al-Qaeda grow inside of Syria. And nobody explained this better than Joe Biden himself. The only part he leaves out here in this clip is when he says our allies helped al-Qaeda in Syria. He leaves out that the U.S. was involved in that too. So he's trying to blame our allies. U.S. was just as involved in this policy.
Probably in charge of it. None of our allies would go off-road without us letting them do something.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So here he is. What? And this is back, by the way, when he was vice president at this point. So this is 2015, I believe, when he says this.
What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens, thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world.
So during this whole period, the Obama administration was claiming we're supporting moderate rebels. And here's Joe Biden blurting out the truth that moderate rebels don't exist, that actually the moderate rebels were al-Qaeda and ISIS and their allies.
You know, I told you that guy was getting driven here one time, one of my Lyft drivers who was from Syria. He was Armenian. He explained the whole thing there to me. And he goes, no, we all liked Assad. That, the Alawite minority, yeah. He goes, they're just the strongest tribe. And if it wasn't for him, he'd have slaughtered all the Christians. Everybody who's not an ISIS Muslim would have been killed if not for Assad. And it was amazing to hear. I never heard anybody from there tell me anything about it.
And that's who the U.S. was supporting, is people who wanted to wipe out religious minorities.
I told him he was welcome.
Yeah. Here's more.
Now you think I'm exaggerating? Take a look. Where did all of this go? So now what's happening? All of a sudden, everybody's awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was al-Qaeda in Iraq, which when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space and territory in eastern Syria, worked with al-Nusra, who we declared a terrorist group early on.
Nusra is al-Qaeda.
And we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying them.
Now that's a straight up lie, because the U.S. was coordinating the dirty war, the arms rat line that was going to transfer weapons to these death squads. So,
we could have stopped giving them weapons to give to them at any time.
Absolutely, absolutely. So he's trying to pretend as if this is all our allies' fault. He's trying to throw Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia under the bus, when really this was a U.S. policy all along. And the reason why we know this was U.S. policy all along is because they acknowledged it to themselves privately, that they were siding with al-Qaeda. So this is back years before Joe Biden said this. Joe Biden's current national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, who's been a longtime aide to Joe Biden, he wrote this to Hillary Clinton. He said this: al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. That was back in February 2012. So they knew exactly who they were siding with and who they were arming. It was al-Qaeda. And that was Joe Biden trying to do damage control. And he had to apologize after he said this, not because he said anything wrong, but because he told the truth. And so he had to go on an apology tour to Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia because he blurted out the truth. He just left out the U.S. role. So now Matt Gaetz is trying to push for a U.S. withdrawal from Syria. And we'll see how Democrats respond. Eric Sperling, who's with a great group called Just Foreign Policy, pointed this out, that he pointed this out back when this was happening, that Congressmember Jamal Bowman, one of the few positive things I think Jamal Bowman's done, he had a measure on the unauthorized U.S. military presence in Syria. And when they had a vote on this, 155 members of Congress, including 60% of House Democrats, voted to cut all funds for the Syria mission within 1 year if the president is unable to get authorization from Congress. So that's not a bad measure. But now Matt Gaetz is going even further, because he's not even saying we're going to cut funding from within 1 year unless we get authorization. He's saying, I want to withdraw all U.S. troops now. And we'll see if Democrats are on board with this. Here's Anya Parnpil. Important development. Congressmember Gaetz introduced a bill to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria via the War Powers Resolution. Seems like a common sense move. Will progressives join the effort? Great question. Here's Jamal Bowman back in 2021. Our military presence in Syria must not continue without congressional approval. The human and financial costs are too high for the American people to go unheard. And he's talking about this amendment. Well, Matt Gaetz has gone further than Jamal Bowman. Now he's saying, let's withdraw all U.S. troops from Syria now, and let's finally end a illegal military occupation that the people presiding over openly admit is designed to steal Syria's oil and wheat.
Doing live stand-up comedy in Tempe, Palm Springs, Milwaukee, Nashville, Northampton, Massachusetts, Syracuse, Cohoes, New York, and Hartford, Connecticut. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets and become a premium member. Get access to all our content.